Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you. That was just so amazing. But as impressive as Amy and Stephanie are, what I find most inspiring is that there are many students like them in our AI for All programs. But so far, I've only told you half of the AI for All story, the part about how it started here at Stanford. By 2016, the demand for our Stanford camp far exceeded all expectations, with students flying in from Ohio, New Jersey, Connecticut, or even China. We realized Stanford alone couldn't keep up. As luck would have it, I crossed paths with the true ally in the fall of 2016. Melinda Gates and I began a series of conversations about our concerns and sense of urgency to make AI and tech more inclusive and diverse, starting from students in classrooms and reaching to workplaces in the industry. Not only did she support and encourage our vision for AI for all, but she coordinated an early funding round to help us grow. And that quote I used about guys in hoodies earlier, it was hers. What began as a Stanford program became a national nonprofit in early 2017, co-founded by Olga, Dr. Rick Sommer, myself, and a great team of staff led by Tess Posner, board members, and advisors. That year, we expanded to a second campus at UC Berkeley. Now, in 2019, I'm very proud to say we'll be on 10 campuses this summer, from Boston to Pittsburgh, from New York City to Phoenix, Arizona, and many more are in the plan. Dr. Olga Rusakovsky, now graduated and an assistant professor at Princeton, founded a chapter there as well. Our students expanded to become an even more diverse group, with an emphasis on women, people of color, and students from low-income families and rural communities. This simply wouldn't have been possible without the generous support of Melinda Gates, among many others. Now, I have heard that behind every great woman, there is a great man. And I think it's actually true in this case. Melinda Gates and her husband Bill Gates co-founded and run the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which has dedicated itself to expanding opportunity to the world's most disadvantaged people and communities. They've done truly amazing work on global issues like healthcare, education, and income inequality, and are perhaps most famous for their aggressive mission to eradicate malaria. Bill, of course, has his own legacy in tech, which began by writing a basic language interpreter in 1975. He co-founded Microsoft and led the company to become the worldwide leader in business and personal computing software and services. After decades spent in the software industry, which he arguably helped to create, he shifted his focus to working at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in 2008. As a tech leader turned philanthropist, Bill is a valuable ally in our quest to use technology to make the entire world a better place. So to join Amy and Stephanie in a conversation about the future of AI, please welcome Mr. Bill Gates.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. Gates. I guess just to jump right in, to start off on a positive note, what excites you about AI and its potential to benefit humanity?
Well, there's so many things that are deeply mysterious. The ones that I get to focus on have to do with health in developing countries. 95% of the children who die under the age of 5 are in these countries where we have almost no doctors and we don't have the skills to bring the kind of interventions that we take for granted here. So the idea that we can take AI and understand, for example, why prematurity rates are so high, and understand the nutritional deficits that take place. Of the kids in these very poor countries, up to 20% of them die before the age of 5, and 40% of the remainder will never develop physically or mentally to their full capacity. So they are deeply malnourished during their early years, and so their ability to learn and contribute is permanently damaged. We've always known that there's various dietary influences, that the microbiome affects both the prematurity and these nutritional outcomes, but it's only with AI, including partnerships with the Mark Davis lab, immunology lab here at Stanford, that we're taking all that data and using AI to understand, okay, what is it about proteins or pathogens? And some really low-cost interventions are now emerging to help us intervene and dramatically reduce prematurity in this malnutrition. So it's when I see it applied to something that without AI, it's just too complex. We never would have seen how that system works, that I feel like, wow, that is a very good thing.
Moreover, what are some actionable items one can take to ensure the responsible and ethical development of human-centered AI?
Well, the world hasn't had that many technologies that are both promising and dangerous. We had nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. And so far, so good, although memories seem to be fading on that, and recent behavior certainly is deeply concerning on that front. With AI, the power of it is so incredible that it will change society in some very deep ways. So it's great that Stanford's stepping up. One of the early pictures in there was actually of Shaky the robot over at SRI. And I was 13 years old when I saw that video of Shaky. And it's funny to think how over-optimistic we were. Like, oh, okay, Shaky is stacking up the blocks. Now, let's get it out in the factory tomorrow. And this is going to be really easy to solve these problems. And so for a long time, AI, when I started Microsoft, I literally wrote a note to my parents, and I said, okay, I may miss a bunch of breakthroughs in AI, and that'll be what I give up to create this company, but oh well. Well, for about 20 years, I didn't miss much. More recently, there's amazing things going on, and fortunately, Microsoft has gotten to a size that it, along with Google and many others, gets to participate. But the fact that the technology is moving so quickly, and the policies and understanding around it, even something just as simple as, okay, face recognition, what sort of awareness and use case should there be for that? Even that, and these are not issues that confine themselves to nation-state boundaries in a simple way like a lot of previous technologies. So it is concerning that someday Stanford wouldn't want to brag about how it was a pioneer in AI, unless we do a good job managing it.
Yeah, I guess along the same lines, as we see that problems are becoming more and more complex and require collaboration across disciplines, how would you encourage this cross-disciplinary collaboration that is central to the development of human-centered AI?
Well, there are potential collaborations. Another area our foundation works in a lot is the U.S. education system. And there, the very basic questions about why are some teachers so good, why are some students not very well motivated, and other students are very well motivated. Unfortunately, with deep correlations with socioeconomic factors, we are really at the very beginning of that. You know, the state of the art is such that everything we've learned about education in the last 100 years, you could not say that the best teacher, the most inspirational, excellent teacher lived 100 years ago. That's how much we've learned about education. Now, doctors, it's a little better. You wouldn't say that the best, cancer doctor or eye doctor was one that somebody went to 100 years. In the case of the US, the dropout rates have not improved. The overall academic achievement has not improved, even as we've doubled the percentage of GDP that goes into the field. So the opportunity here to take and get out of endless debates, but to really look into, okay, what are those good teachers doing? What is the nature of that motivation? Which interventions can really change that? That would be a very profound thing. Education is sort of primal, and yet if you look in the R&D percentage that society assigns to education, where do the smartest people go in? Do they go into educational research? How does the educational research budget compare to, say, the NIH research budget? What is the equivalent of BERT in the world of educational research, where somebody has something profound and everybody goes, ooh, that's so fantastic? There is no equivalent. It's a kind of a desert. So anyway, I think it is a chance, given the incredibly general purpose nature of these technologies, to find patterns and insights. It's a chance to do something in terms of social science policy, particularly education policy, also, healthcare quality, healthcare cost. It's a chance to take systems that are inherently complex in nature and that just individuals kind of trying to troll through the data can only find weird correlations, like, okay, Minneapolis spends half as much as Texas, but okay, how do you intervene? What is the next step? Or kids growing up in a certain location seem to do better income and race independent than other locations. That's the kind of thing a human might spot, but these systems should help us look not just at correlation, but try interventions and see causation as well. So, it's a chance to supercharge the social sciences, with the most important by far being education itself.
On a different note, what do you think are some of the biggest problems that artificial intelligence can uniquely solve?
Well, if something is complex enough, like you take the microbiome, that's billions of data points. Even the subspecies matter a great deal, we've proven recently, not just macro statistics like diversity or lactobacillus or something, but you really have to get down and look at those gene profiles. We have this incredible result that if you give kids in some countries once a year an antibiotic that costs 2 cents called azithromycin, you save 100,000 lives. And in a sense, it makes no sense because you can't, that antibiotic is disappearing from their system within a few days. So there's something about their microbiome, the intestinal gut junction health, that has this profound effect. And I don't believe that without machine learning techniques, we will ever be able to take the dimensionality of this problem and be able to find the solution about what is going on there. And once we understand it, of course, we'd like to magnify that effect and avoid using a broad spectrum antibiotic, which has resistance type effects at all. So many complex problems and many very complex data sets, only with these techniques that are, in a sense, pattern recognition techniques. The upper bound before the breakthroughs in machine learning was such that many deep societal problems were not tractable. Now, if we get the data sets, make sure they're used appropriately, because I think we can deal with privacy concerns and yet still have the type of deep longitudinal information that would reveal these patterns. And so it's a chance, whether it's governance, education, health, to accelerate the advances in all the sciences.
Yeah, you mentioned the potential that AI has to benefit society in many ways. Could you talk about an AI application that has already been positively transformative to society?
Well, I wouldn't say there are, that many. Certainly the search engine technology that Google or Bing are using, which has been greatly beneficial. The amount of AI that's being applied there is super impressive, and that led to the sort of foundational in terms of the cloud platform and how that was created in a very generalized way. In terms of actual medicines that would not have been discovered, the next 10 years are where you're going to see that in this dramatic form. In particular, the work on prematurity. To give an example, we took the 23andMe data, working with them, and saw by using AI learning that there was this deep association with malfunctioning selenium processing genes and risk of prematurity. And so we literally have now 20,000 women who live in areas of Africa that their natural diet has no selenium in it, that we are intervening by giving them small amounts. So we'll know 18 months from now, and based on preliminary data, we expect to see about a 15% reduction in prematurity, which for Africa as a whole would project out to be about 80,000 lives saved per year. Which always, when you show one picture in one life, it's more dramatic than tens of thousands. So I think it's the current set of things. The deep machine learning didn't really get into the drug discovery process or what had been called systems biology until quite recently. And in the case of education, it is not yet, we have not even begun to do that work in terms of understanding motivation and engagement and teaching styles and teaching assistants that would really improve the output of the system, i.e. better learning, less dropouts, key things that the current status is deeply unsatisfactory.
I think for the remainder of the time, we would want to open the floor for some questions from the audience. When it is your turn, please state your name and affiliation. And in the interest of time, please keep your questions brief so we can get to as many as possible. I think we have one up front.
Hi, I'm Kumadev Chatterjee. I'm the founder of Unmanned Life, where we're trying to use human-centered AI to do autonomous systems. And so my question back to you, Dr. Gates, and of course to you was, where do you see the boundary between ethics and machine learning, particularly when it's applied to autonomous? So we're moving to an autonomous society where most things will be done by machines in one way or another. So where is the boundary there between the ethics and the machine learning and the data sets that we're getting? It's particularly because autonomy can be very, in a certain sense, very anodyne. So how do we ensure that ethically it does the right thing?
Well, it's a very broad question. There's different domains and there's different degree of autonomy. The book Army of None talks about the current weapon systems that we have, like the Aegis missile firing system, that by most definitions is an autonomous system, that it is authorized to fire based on incoming targets. And there were a few cases where it accidentally shot down a commercial airliner. So even in that case where people thought it was very well bounded, it turned out to be very complex. Now then again, you don't want to be too risk averse on these things, because the idea of solving very tough problems, you always have to compare it to what the current solution is. So, if you're not going to have as many car wrecks, you might not want to set the criteria at 0. Then again, enforcing good behavior or understanding what the liability regime will be. That's probably why autonomous cars, the US in certain respects will be one of the last places in the world that you'll see very widespread use, because our sense of liability and our desire to preserve the status quo, if there's any chance that something might be, even in a framework, considered a step backwards, that's very tricky. The place that I think this is most concerning is in weapon systems. In the medical field, we just don't have doctors. Most people are born and die in Africa without coming near to a doctor. And so there are definitely things like we're doing a lot of work with analyzing ultrasound. And we can do things like sex blind the output because we're not having anybody actually see the image. We can tell you what's going on without revealing the gender, which is, of course, when you do that, it drives gender side. And yet we're doing the analysis, the medical understanding in a much deeper way. And that's an example where it's all done with a lot of machine learning. I was meeting with the guys at Google who are helping us with this morning, and there's some incredible promise in that field where in the primary healthcare system, the amount of sophistication to do diagnosis, to understand, for example, is this a high-risk pregnancy? Yes, let's escalate that person to go to the hospital level, even though you couldn't afford to do that on a widespread basis. So this stuff is going to be very domain-specific. In some domains like education, I'm more worried that the privacy concerns, which are appropriate, they're good privacy concerns, but if you don't put a lot of creativity in how you have longitudinal data access while not violating privacy, you're going to default to the data sets not being there. And in the US education today, that is the default, that there isn't much information that would allow you to find positive exemplars either at the teacher or school or district level, and therefore really examine what inputs are allowing for that unusually positive performance.
So if you're thinking deeply about technology and ethics, are there any things that you think in retrospect you might have wanted to do differently in your time leading Microsoft, or any lessons you learned thinking about that past?
Well, certainly the really profound societal changes from personal computing are really just beginning. And so we didn't disrupt the way that people get news or communicate. It led, the PC led to the internet, led to the cell phone, led to social media today. And so the awareness that once you had made that access to information, including information that stimulates you or that you agree with, and that you could cluster in that way, there wasn't a recognition way in advance that that kind of freedom would have these pretty dramatic effects that we're just beginning to debate today. A lot of the personal computing early period, we were worried about the so-called digital divide. That is, that the computers would be available to the kids who are better off and accentuate rather than reduce. Now, at a classroom level, the actual data about the value of computers in the classroom is essentially nil. So that's good. We didn't create this gigantic digital divide. That is, the schools with the computers are just as bad as the schools without the computers. which in an absolute sense, they're quite bad. And so sometimes you get false positives when you worry about, because you think your solution is so incredibly magical. There are things in terms of internet access, getting that out to rural areas, getting it into parts of Africa. That's a unfinished agenda that through a variety of cheaper satellite antennas, so-called white space type access. I do think that general connectivity issue that we've been working on for over 20 years largely will become a solved problem. And I hope that computers prove to be very valuable in classrooms so that then we do have the need to get them out on a very widespread basis. But only at the individual levels do you see, in terms of the highly motivated learner, do you see that it really has changed the learning outcomes. And that's only in, say, the top 15% of the highly motivated learners.
Hi, my name is Ron Lee. I'm a physician and focusing on integration of AI in clinical processes for the healthcare system at Stanford. We often think about in medicine and other fields of relying on AI to reduce error. And even in medicine, we have seen algorithms with error rates that are lower than that of the human. But at the same time, when an AI system makes an error, the effects on society, but also just how society perceives that error is very different than when a human makes an error. So doctors make mistakes all the time, but then when you have some AI system making that same mistake, the reaction is very different. So I wonder, how do you think about this dichotomy and its effects on how AI would progress and be accepted by society?
Yeah, a good example of this is another group that the foundation funds has done work where you just use a cell phone camera to take a picture of a woman's cervix to predict whether she has cervical cancer and that you should intervene. And the results, the National Cancer Institute is very engaged in this because the results are dramatic compared to the very best humans. And of course, the typical humans, particularly as you get out into developing world settings, are either not available at all or their performance is well below the gold standard, which we were able to exceed here. And so certainly on those image recognition things, that's getting to a point of maturity, and hopefully that it will become accepted. One thing that we're going to have to build in is a feedback mechanism. That is, when the algorithm makes a mistake, the ability to take that training set and constantly improve it, because something new may come along that the original training basis wasn't good enough. And completing that circle, even in the US, that's a very difficult thing to do. When you're out in rural Africa and you don't have these electronic health records to say, okay, you tested this person, you told her she didn't have cervical cancer. Isn't it interesting that 3 years later she died of cervical cancer? Let's go back and look at those images. So you want to complete that loop. And as usual, if you have negative consequences for mistakes, it kind of discourages that completing the loop type system. There are a few cases, like in civil aviation, where the willingness to look at mistakes and apply massive resources like we're seeing today to say, okay, what went wrong here? It really is pretty mind-blowing. And of course, you have software-based elements, including the 737 MAX case. And so we through software-driven surgical tools, software-driven flight tools, software-driven weapon systems, we are accumulating a sense of understanding. It is fairly troubling that today's deep learning systems are mostly opaque. And so one hopes that sometime in the next decade, somebody comes up with AI systems that are both as good or better than what we have today, and yet have a degree of explainability, including the sort of strange false positives that make absolutely no sense to human cognition that still, for most, take the visual side of these things, do trigger in a way that is somewhat, would not have been predicted. It is impressive today, the FDA is taking in diagnostic tests. There's 3 that were given the early approval, where there is this notion of dynamic improvement that will go on. And that will actually have more impact in the developing world for things like tuberculosis and malaria. We just have way more lives to save than the US does. I mean, if everybody in the US, lived to 100, it would not match what we can do in the developing world in terms of the net change to human benefit. So it's nice that it gets piloted here, but a lot of the impact is where you don't have the human comparator is not at all what we take for granted.
My name is Elian Tai. I'm a Stanford PhD student, and I'm curious about so in the past few weeks, we just had a lot of rains in Northern California, and it's hard to imagine here we have been suffering from droughts in the past few years. Now we are suffering from the impacts of floods. So I'm curious, in terms of AI, how do you think we can make use of AI to help those who are affected by floods or other kinds of natural disasters, and allow the whole society work together, not just within Stanford bubble, but also make the huge impact and work with the citizens together? Thank you.
Yeah, the last time I was in this room, we were talking about climate change. And of course, climate models are extremely imprecise. Unfortunately, AI alone will not make those models precise. The amount of data that you would need to really understand, over a period of months or years, weather conditions requires a really pretty unbelievable amount of data. You can sort of prove it because of the huge nonlinearities in the system there. These systems can improve to some degree, and so if you can predict floods, if you can predict drought, that's good. We do know that we need to make our systems more resilient because climate change, we do know, brings higher variance. And so if you're a farmer in Africa today, a subsistence farmer, which is 70% of the people who live in abject poverty, today you get about 1 out of 10 years where your crop completely fails and you need a buffer stock or government programs. It appears it'll get by the end of the century to about 1 year out of 4. Now, in the Western world, you have savings, you have governments with tons of money. As long as your gross productivity isn't going down substantially, then you just are able to cover that year. If you're a subsistence farmer, what it means is that your kid is getting so little nutrition that if they survive, they are permanently damaged. And so it'd be great, to have the very best AI work and the very best weather modeling work and the data collection. That is actually a huge limiting factor, is how you program up the resolution of the initial conditions, including in the ocean, the hardest piece being the biosphere, because you have very nonlinear reactions to weather and heating within the biological systems, including the biological systems that are in the ocean. So I wouldn't sit here and make some fantastic prediction that we will be able to model out those negative things. You want to have a lot of extra resources. You want to be agile about bringing those extra resources to bear, primarily in equatorial regions where you have subsistence farmers. And the world is not very good at that today. We have the World Food Program that does some of those things. But if your figure of merit is avoiding malnutrition when you have negative weather variants, we do a very, very bad job of it.
Hi, my name is Layla. I'm a student at Stanford. Does it concern you that AI talent and innovation is concentrated in a few big tech firms and universities? And if so, how can we encourage more competition?
Yeah, in a sense, when you have something that's competitive, where somebody's ahead of other people and is at the state of the art, it's not normal that you'd have lots of people who are at an identical position. So you take like designing nuclear weapons. We didn't have like lots and lots of places in the world that were the equivalent of Los Alamos. There was, we did create the competition with Lawrence Livermore Labs, but just to have a tiny bit of diversity there. And so I think you have to draw a bit of, yes, we should draw more universities in. And universities in general are motivated to think more about societal benefit than the private sector. And so it would be unfortunate if the universities fall behind. And so it's great that Stanford is putting together these initiatives. And there are even questions about access to cloud computing power that matches what the private sector has, and how we're going to make sure that Stanford and hundreds of other universities actually can run data sets. I mean, for example, if you want to look at bias in word embeddings, you better be able to create the state-of-the-art word embedding system and have access to play around with that system. And unless we're careful, the private sector will kind of run away, not just with smart people, but also with the ability to do super, super complex models. So yes, it'd be good. Most advanced technologies in the US post-World War II were created as part of the military-industrial complex. And therefore, the US, in terms of its application to weapons and sort of the government itself being involved at an early stage to think through what these things mean, it was natural that the government was seeing it partly through wearing that defense-related thinking. Now that these AI technologies are completely done by universities and private companies, with the private companies being somewhat ahead, the government just doesn't see it in the same way that they did with previous technologies. And hopefully things like your institute will bring in legislators and executive branch people, maybe even a few judges, to get up to speed on these things, because the pace and the global nature of it, and the fact that it's really outside of government hands, does make it particularly challenging. The US was in this totally unique position for most of these breakthrough technologies. And now, yes, the US is still very much the leader, but not in the same dominant way that you can be sure, say, hey, 10 years from now, will the best AI that does reading and scans the scientific literature to look for biological advances, will that be best here in the United States, or might it be in other locations? Very hard to say. And even the definition, when somebody says to me, is China ahead on AI? That's an ill-defined question, because there isn't a boundary where there's, oh, that's Chinese AI. Oh, that's US AI. For Microsoft, we have a lab in Beijing. Google has a lab in Beijing. Some of the best AI work in the world is being done across the street from Tsinghua University. Now, what kind of AI is that? It's global AI. And if people start thinking of this in terms of nation-state terms and try to draw boundaries, that's going to be potentially difficult and potentially quite problematic.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Please join me in thanking Mr. Gates and Stephanie for being here with us today.
Thank you.